So, today we're talking about psychopaths. Now, psychopaths is quite a burgeoning topic in the responsibility literature for quite a good reason that should be obvious from this discussion. Incidentally, this paper, I gotta say, I did not enjoy reading it the first time through. She has a way of stating things in enormously long, multi-claused sentences that, you know, you've forgotten what the sentence was about by the time you reach the end. But on a second read through, I think there's a lot going on here. And I assigned it because it's one of the more recent articles, and it also does a nice job of sort of summarizing the state of the debate up to when she was writing. Psychopaths. All right. The thing about psychopaths, as she says at the beginning, here's the puzzle that psychopaths present us with. When we think about psychopaths' actions and the pleasure they sometimes take in inflicting harm, it seems as if we are correct in blaming them. In other words, in holding them responsible for their actions. You can't blame somebody unless you regard them as morally responsible for what they have done. So a lot of this literature now, instead of talking directly about moral responsibility, talks about blaming practices, and you know there's a slight difference, but they're very closely overlapping. It seems we are correct in blaming them, but when we think about their deficits, that is, what makes them psychopaths, it seems we are incorrect to do so. So I don't know how much you know about psychopaths. I don't know a great deal. Maybe you know more than me. Maybe you know a psychopath. I saw the philosopher David Shoemaker come and give a talk here at UM Flint on psychopaths, and he said his sister was married to one who is now in prison, which was where he was exposed to psychopaths up close and personal. Like a lot of things, psychopathy is a contested condition. That is, it's not entirely clear whether it's an actual thing that marks genuinely different kinds of human beings, and specifically brains. That is there a difference between the brains of normal people and psychopaths? Hard to know. There's a famous test. And incidentally, I recommend a book called The Psychopath Test by the British writer, and he's been on TV shows and stuff, and claims to have discovered Alex Jones. So this is John Ronson, Jon, no H. He claims to have kind of launched Alex Jones from obscurity in an early report he did. But he has a very engaging writing style. He's a bit like the guy Louis Theroux, who is very famous in England as well. Anyway, Jon Ronson, The Psychopath Test. Here he discusses in a very accessible way this test that is mentioned in passing in the Nelkin article, which is by a guy called Hare, and it is a checklist that you can run down. And depending on depending on your answers to the questions on the checklist, you're given a score. And the higher the score, the more psychopathic you are. So it looks like it's kind of a continuum. So you can be mildly psychopathic, and there are middle cases where you're just a bit of a jerk, maybe, and you're not a psychopath. There's also this other thing that he refers to, the moral/conventional test by a guy called Curiel, which is challenged mentioned at the beginning of the article and challenged, she describes a challenge to it at the end. But one of the things that psychopaths are supposedly incapable of doing is easily distinguishing between genuinely moral transgressions, like breaking somebody's arm for fun, and just conventional transgressions, like, and the example given, which actually sounds rather old-fashioned, is a boy wearing a dress to school. The one is considered merely a conventional transgression that is wrong and objectionable only because of sort of societal standards that if they changed, we wouldn't really care, except, you know, there are certain people who get really upset about conventional transgressions. Whereas the other, breaking somebody's arm for fun, is not just a violation of a convention, it's a violation of a moral rule. And psychopaths are supposedly not able to tell the difference. So in other words, it looks like they view moral rules as just conventions. In other words, they hold moral rules as sort of unimportant as conventions. Just as we say, well, you know, I don't see anything wrong with wearing a dress to school, but, you know, it gets other people upset, so I know that I'll get into trouble if I do it, but if I did it, I wouldn't really be doing anything wrong. They hold that kind of view about breaking somebody's arm for fun. So not nice. There are other supposed indicators of psychopathy, like, for example, the one that David Shoemaker mentioned that was sort of kind of convinced him that it was a genuine phenomenon and that there genuinely were psychopaths whose brains were different than the rest of us, is that, for example, if you give someone a shock and then you tell them, I'm going to give you another shock in like 10 seconds, you know, an electric shock. Normal people, their heart rate goes through the roof and their palms start sweating as the clock counts down because they know what's coming. Psychopaths, that doesn't happen. So they don't like getting a shock. They get angry. And in theory, they should know that another shock is coming and it won't be pleasant, but they don't react to that in the right way. And there's all this discussion of psychopaths. For example, this is mentioned in the John Ronson Psychopath Test book. It's been argued that, for example, very successful businessmen, CEOs, are all psychopaths because in order to be so successful, they need to so disregard the interests of others and be so sort of focused solely on what advances their own interests that it amounts to a genuine psychopathy. That is, it's not just that they're ambitious, but they genuinely are disregard the interests of others because that's what enables them to be so successful. John Ronson is unconvinced, and I remember David Shoemaker also being unconvinced because he says one of the things that is indicative of real psychopaths is that they can't hold a job. Like they lose interest. They are in some sense interested in their own benefits. They're interested in furthering their own interests, but they can't sort of stick to it. So real psychopaths, he said, tend to sort of succeed and often in scams and things like this that involve exploiting other people, but then they get sloppy and they get caught, or they just drift. They drift from job to job. So he didn't think that it was at all likely that a genuine psychopath could last long enough to reach a CEO position. Okay, now what exactly is wrong with a psychopath? Well, one thing that is suggested of psychopaths is that they are morally incompetent. That is, they are incapable of getting moral demands. So they have this kind of inability. They have a deficit. Yes, so for example, in the Nelkin article, she quotes a couple of writers, Matthew Talbot, who was a friend of David Shoemaker's, and I remember Shoemaker saying that he disagreed with Talbot on some things. Talbot and Gary Watson. Gary Watson is probably the most famous in philosophers' circles of these writers. Gary Watson is famously written on responsibility. And it's to Gary Watson that we owe this distinction between attributability and accountability. And Gary Watson was one of the first people to write in this debate on responsibility, to bring up psychopaths. So Talbot says, psychopaths are morally blind agents, unable to grasp, for instance, the difference between moral requirements and requirements generated by social convention. Like I said, breaking an arm versus wearing a dress. Watson says, psychopathy involves an incapacity to recognize the interests of others as making valid claims on them. That is, they might not even be able to recognize that other people have interests in the same way that they have interests. But, if other people have interests, what's that to me? Consequently, they are disabled from engaging in the mutual recognition that lies at the core of moral life. That's what Watson says. So these are some assumptions about psychopaths. Now, in the last section of the article, Nelkin says, are psychopaths really like this? And she says, the jury's out. But even if they aren't, then let's regard this discussion can be construed as about a possible individual, not actually the way that genuine psychopaths are, but imagine there were such an individual who was morally blind in this way. Would it be appropriate to hold them morally responsible? Now, it should be noted that this is all about moral responsibility. As she says in a footnote, legal responsibility is a different matter. She says it's okay to hold psychopaths legally responsible for the harm that they do. Imagine breaking people's arms for fun or whatever. You can legally prosecute them because laws are like social conventions, and they do understand social conventions, and they are capable of changing their behavior to respond to those things. So it's not as if they're like an animal that doesn't get what a rule is and doesn't get consequences. Psychopaths are perfectly capable of understanding consequences, although, that little example of their heartbeat not changing when a shock is about to come might cause one to question this. But they are capable of understanding, if you do this, you will get punished. And they can incorporate that into furthering their own interests. So they will know, oh, if I do that, I'll get into trouble. And they can change their behavior accordingly. But what they cannot do is understand that it's wrong, and its wrongness having an effect on their behavior. Like, for example, we say, if I were to say, have you killed anybody recently? I hope you would say, no, I haven't, because that's wrong. You wouldn't just say, no, I haven't, because that's against the law and I'd get into trouble. The latter, a psychopath could say, but the former, let us assume, psychopaths would never say. They don't understand this concept of something being wrong in terms of because other people's interests are valuable and should constrain one's behavior. They don't get that. Okay, so then the question is, what attitude should we take towards psychopaths given their behavior, given that they do tend to do nasty things? They manipulate other people. So they're not like dangerous animals. Dangerous animals can bite you, and you would say resentment of a dangerous animal for biting you was misplaced. So here I want to remind you of P.F. Strawson's article, Freedom and Resentment. As I said when I discussed it, this article has been enormously influential, and this is one of the areas on which it has been influential. So, for example, Strawson is the first person in the philosophical literature to discuss reactive attitudes, of which the example he uses in the title is resentment. And what's interesting about these attitudes are that they are not just sort of, in some sense, blind emotions. They are emotions with a kind of content and attitude built in. So we can talk about resentment being inappropriate. If I resented a robot for stepping on my foot, that would be an inappropriate resentment. I should, if it was, you know, if somebody said, but that's a robot, it was programmed to do that, it didn't know you were there, it doesn't have any view of you, then my resentment should go away. Resentment is only an appropriate emotion when the target of the resentment has certain capacities. And specifically, it looks like they're moral capacities. Or, in other words, I shouldn't feel resentment towards a being that is incapable of responsibility. That would be silly. I shouldn't resent the shark for biting off my leg. I should maybe hate the shark. I should, you know, I should certainly fear sharks, but resenting it is somehow misplaced. Okay. Can we say that psychopaths are cruel? Now, well, again, think of a shark. Is a shark cruel? No. I think most of us would agree. I mean, sometimes we speak that way. We would say, you know, the shark is a cruel beast or something. You can imagine Quint giving a kind of speech that says things like that in Jaws, you know, like when he talks about they got dead eyes, a doll's eyes, you know. You can imagine him saying that they're cruel. But strictly speaking, sharks are not cruel because cruelty also requires a certain level of ability that a shark lacks. In order to be cruel, think about what that requires. You have to be aware of the effect of what you're doing, and in some sense, understand that what you're doing causes pain to others, and in some sense, you have to do things that cause pain despite knowing that they cause pain. So, cruelty is, there's a word that is thrown around in this area of the literature that Watson introduces in the example, which is arete. And this refers to the Greek word arete, which is usually translated as virtue. And if you've taken a class on Aristotle, you'll know that he came up with a theory. Well, the Greeks in general talked a lot about virtues and vices. And Aristotle has what's called a virtue theory of morality. He says you shouldn't talk about acts being right or wrong. You should talk about people being virtuous or having vices, which is literally vicious. Vicious means having vices. Now, cruelty is a vice. So if you say that someone is cruel, you attribute to them a vice. And again, you can only attribute vices to beings that have relevant kinds of capacities related to responsibility. So these, what Watson did, Gary Watson, whose view Nelkin labels as the middle course view, because it's sort of the mean between two extremes. So the two extremes are unified blameworthiness. The unified blameworthiness view, which is probably most associated with another very famous philosopher. His book was featured in The Good Place, T.M. Scanlon. His name is actually Thomas Scanlon, but everybody calls him Tim Scanlon. I don't know if it's T.M. Scanlon. But anyway, Scanlon, S-C-A-N-L-O-N. He is at Harvard. He's still there, and he's been incredibly influential. And he has various sort of disciples. One of his disciples is Angela Smith, with whom Nelkin engages in a bit of a debate in this article. Okay, so the unified blameworthiness view says that if you are blameworthy in this way, you are also blameworthy in this way. So that is, we cannot do this to you without automatically saying that it is appropriate to hold you accountable. Watson is the one who draws the distinction, and he draws the distinction because he wants to say that it is inappropriate to resent a psychopath. They are not appropriate targets of the reactive attitudes because of their deficits. Nonetheless, however, he wants to say we can call them cruel. We can say we can call them manipulative. There's a bunch of bad labels we can apply to them. We can call them dishonest. We can call them abusive. We can call them hostile. We can call them mean. All of these things are appropriate things to attribute, appropriate qualities to say that individual has them. That individual is cruel, even if they're a psychopath. So, and that is a kind of blaming. So Watson distinguishes these two kinds of blame and says, we can do this, it's appropriate to do this to the psychopath. It is not appropriate to do this to the psychopath. The unified blameworthiness view, Scanlon, Talbot, Angela Smith, say you can't separate these two. That is, if this is an appropriate thing to do to the psychopath, then that automatically means that this is appropriate too. And their argument in support of this is that Nelkin calls the argument from cruelty to accountability. This is on page 366. So we'll look at that in a little bit. So in other words, it goes directly from cruelty, which is an attributable feature, to accountability. So this view, the unified blameworthiness view, says psychopaths can be blamed in both senses. And in fact, if you blame them in one, that guarantees blaming them in another. That means that it's appropriate to blame them in another. So that's sort of, you might regard that as the strictest view. That says we can hold psychopaths responsible in both ways. Then there's the middle course view, which is Watson's view, which says, well, yes, we can blame them in this way, but we can't blame them in this way. Whereas Nelkin, you might say, is the most bleeding heart of them all. She's on the other extreme. She says we can't do either of them. She agrees with Watson that you can separate the two. So she agrees that it is possible to do this to some people without it making it appropriate to do this. So she disagrees with the argument from cruelty to accountability. She doesn't say that if you do this, it means that this is appropriate. She agrees with Watson that you can have separate attitudes, that this is appropriate and this is appropriate. But she says that doesn't apply to the psychopath. For the psychopath, neither of these is appropriate. What it does apply to, so what she says is, what Watson says is true of the psychopath is that you can do this to them but not this. And she says that is true of the incorrigible racist. Now here is someone who we might feel a lot less sanguine about letting them off the hook. I mean, psychopaths, we say their brains are genuinely different. But incorrigible racists, so for example, this might be a slave owner who literally their behavior cannot be altered into regarding their slaves as people, as worthy of respecting. And she says if they're genuinely incorrigible meaning uncorrectable, cannot be corrected, if they're genuinely incorrigible, then they may be cruel, and they may be cruel because they have a capacity that the psychopath lacks, but it is inappropriate to hold them accountable. So we might think that, whoa, Nelkin's being a little too easy on these assholes, right? These people should be held, certainly be held accountable. They should be blamed in both senses. So what Nelkin has to do is both to show against Watson that you can't even call psychopaths cruel. They do hurt you. They are dangerous, but they're not cruel, she's going to argue. But she's also going to argue that these incorrigible racists, it is inapt to resent them. So a slave who has been enslaved by this incorrigible slave owner, it's inappropriate for the slave to resent this person. That's a pretty strong claim. Okay, let's start at one extreme. Let's look at the unified blameworthiness view. So the unified blameworthiness view says that not only can we hold psychopaths, can we attribute vices to the psychopath, call them cruel and things like that. This leads to it being appropriate for us to blame them in the accountability sense, which involves, for example, regarding them as the appropriate target of resentment and things like that. All right, so let's look at the argument from cruelty to accountability. This is summarized, it's a very simple argument on page 366. Psychopaths' actions manifest cruelty or contempt towards others. This is something that Watson would say, yes, that is true. Now, here's where Watson would disagree. So Watson thinks, yes, that is true. Psychopaths' actions manifest cruelty. Psychopaths have contempt towards others. If you say that, you are attributing contempt to them. So, for example, sharks can't do that. Sharks do not have contempt for us. They don't have any attitude towards us. They just recognize us as food. If one's actions do this, if one's actions manifest contempt or cruelty, one is worthy of resentment. So, psychopaths are worthy of resentment. If one is worthy of resentment, then one is accountable. So psychopaths are accountable for their actions. Now, this argument that is sort of an argument by the unified blameworthiness view against someone like Watson, who says that you can separate these two. So the unified blameworthiness says, no, look, if you agree, as Watson does, that you can attribute properties like cruelty and contempt to the psychopath, then that means that you've got to hold them accountable. You cannot do as Watson does, separate them. Say, this is appropriate for the psychopaths, this is not. So think of this as an argument by one extreme against the middle. Now, where Nelkin is going to stick up for this distinction, well, actually, where Nelkin is going to respond to this is a move that Watson wouldn't like. So in some sense, Nelkin kind of agrees, or well, no, she doesn't, because she ends up saying that the incorrigible racist, you can say that they're cruel without holding them accountable. But where she's going to pick at this particular argument from psychopaths' cruelty to accountability is she's going to deny that psychopaths are cruel. So she's going to say, no, psychopaths are not cruel. Psychopaths are dangerous. Psychopaths are to be avoided if you spot one, stay well away. But that is also true of sharks. She gives this argument that she uses an example of Watson's, which is this thing he calls the Cyclops. I assume it's something of a pun. I haven't read the original Watson article. You know, a Cyclops is that one-eyed giant that features in the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, who captures Odysseus and his crew and eats them one by one until Odysseus blinds him by shoving a big flaming tree in his eye. So it's like one of those in that this creature eats humans, but it is a psychopathic, one that's sort of analogous to the psychopath, so hence it's spelt in this way. So this is a fictional creature, but the point of this creature is, which is described on page 367. Let's see, 367. It is a creature that is capable of certain things, but not capable of showing cruelty. So, for example, the Cyclops is a simple creature with two basic ends: to eat food that it finds tasty and to preserve its own life. It can make judgments. So in that sense, it's more sophisticated than, say, a shark. It can make judgments such as F's flavor counts in favor of eating it, where F might be you. A human's flavor counts in favor of eating it. And if doing X would lead to eating something tasty, that counts in favor of doing it. You know, if catching a human would lead to eating something tasty, then that counts in favor of catching a human. Perhaps these judgments even implicate the judgment that the lethal effects of eating a human being do not matter or count as a reason for refraining. But nonetheless, it looks like we would say what is true of the Cyclops is that it shows a lack of respect for what we would normally consider moral agents. So human beings, for example, are in general moral agents. This Cyclops, regarding them as an okay source of food, clearly shows a lack of respect for human beings. Respect is one of these attitudes that we're supposed to have. It's not an appropriate attitude to have towards a rock. You don't have to respect a rock. Meat eaters would say you don't have to respect a cow because it doesn't have the relevant abilities to engage in moral transactions with. But you're certainly supposed to respect human beings. Clearly the Cyclops shows a lack of respect. But is the Cyclops cruel? Nelkin is going to say no, because while the Cyclops shows a lack of respect, this is different from disrespect. So merely lacking respect is something, for example, we could say is true of a shark. A shark doesn't respect us, but does it disrespect us? Can you think of a shark as dissing you? No, obviously not, because it isn't capable of understanding what it is to respect someone. So merely to lack respect is consistent with not even getting what respect is. Whereas to disrespect someone, you have to know what respect is and intentionally not respect someone who you understand is usually the correct, it is appropriate to respect. Now, she gives what she calls the symmetry argument. I forgot to label that. The symmetry argument on page 367 to 8. She says, imagine something like the Cyclops, Imagine a creature who lacks all moral understanding and does not see others' interests as fundamentally reason-giving, but who, along with beer and cigarettes, enjoys watching car chases and other people enjoying themselves. He doesn't care about, enjoys watching car chases, and here's the crucial part, other people enjoying themselves. So this creature, simple creature like the psychops, enjoys watching other people enjoying themselves. So he gets pleasure from other people getting pleasure. Would we call this being kind? And she says, clearly we would not call this being kind. Their behavior is the same as behavior which, if you or I evince this kind of behavior, we would be called kind. If we behaved in such a way that we furthered other people's interests in enjoying themselves, this would merit attributing the virtue of kindness to us. So this creature that she's describing behaves in a way such that if we behaved that way, we would be kind. But this creature is not kind precisely because they lack a relevant ability to be capable of virtues. So, as she says at the bottom of page 367, these things don't add up to kindness unless one does something for the sake of someone, whereas this creature is incapable of understanding what it is to do something for the sake of someone. They don't get that other people are the kind of things that you can do things for the sake of. They don't understand that. They behave like someone's kind because they themselves derive pleasure from seeing you get pleasure. So they act to you in a way that furthers your interests that looks like kindness. But it isn't kindness. This is called the argument from symmetry because she says, if you agree that a creature like this is not kind, well, then you agree that you can't attribute a particular virtue to it. Cruelty is the sort of mirror image vice to the virtue of kindness. So by symmetry, if you agree that a creature like this is not kind, you should agree that a creature that causes pain to you, and in fact derives pleasure from causing pain to you, is nonetheless not cruel. So just as this creature that derives pleasure from seeing you in pleasure is not kind, then a creature like that who derived pleasure from seeing you in pain would not be cruel, because they do not disrespect you. So she says what they lack and what they would need to be capable of cruelty is she distinguishes three kinds of insensitivity on page 368, and they lack the third sense, which is one must be capable of grasping these moral facts but simply not care about them. So in order to be cruel, you must be insensitive to others' demands in the way that you get that they give demands to you by their status as a moral being, and you just don't care. If that's you, then you're cruel. But it's not this creature because they don't get that. So they don't care about your interests, but because they're not capable of caring about your interests. So they do lack respect, but they don't disrespect you. To disrespect you, you have to get that respect is appropriate and then not do it. Whereas to lack respect, you just don't even get what respect is. So, to bring this back to where we were, the Unified Blameworthiness group started from the claim that psychopaths were cruel and said if they're cruel, it's appropriate to resent them, and if it's appropriate to resent them, it's appropriate to hold them accountable. Because the difference between these two kinds of blaming is that this one doesn't come with consequences other than people think you're an asshole, right? This one, accountability, as its name implies, involves effects on you. If you're held accountable, bad stuff is coming your way. Now, the basic level of reactive attitudes, well, that's not really that bad. You know, people resent you. Is that all that happens to me? Woo, I don't really care, you might say. But nonetheless, resentment is sort of the thin end of the wedge. That is, once people resent you, that means that they are entitled to do something to you. They may not follow up on it, but they're entitled to. And they will, you know, certainly they won't engage in interactions with you that could be to your benefit. So you will certainly lose out if people resent you. But resentment can lead to, the accountability starts with resentment and then extends to things like, hey, you've got to apologize. Remember that we're talking about moral violations. We're not bringing in legal ramifications. But, you know, you might be forced to apologize, forced to change your behavior, that kind of thing. That would be holding you accountable. Okay. So she says that with this symmetry argument, that she gives an example of something that she says behaves in a way that looks like kindness, but we agree is not kindness. And she says, well, that's what the psychopath is doing. The psychopath is doing things that look like cruelty, but they're not cruel. Now, what can the unified blameworthiness people say? Let's put it. Let's move on now to Watson's argument for argument that it is not appropriate to hold psychopaths accountable. And these are a couple of arguments. For example, the argument from intelligibility, or to give its full title, the argument from the intelligibility of moral address on page 374. Resentment of an agent for an action is appropriate only if the agent is accountable for that action. An agent is accountable for an action only if it is apt to make demands on that agent. So remember, accountability comes with consequences, and this is spelled out in terms of making demands on them. So resentment of an agent is appropriate only if it is appropriate to make demands on the agent. One can aptly make demands of an agent only if the agent has the capacity to comprehend moral demands. So it is only appropriate to make demands on someone if they can get it. So, for example, it is inapt to say to a shark, well, what have you got to say for yourself? You know, that you're wasting your time, because you're treating them, you're making demands on them that they haven't got the ability to meet. An agent can act in a way that shows cruelty. Remember, this is Watson's view. An agent can act in a way that shows cruelty and at the same time lack the capacity to comprehend moral demands as normatively relevant. So this premise 5 in Roman numerals on page 374, is something that Watson would say, because he wants to say psychopaths, this is okay, but this isn't. So you can have this without it being appropriate to do that. So an agent can act in a way that shows cruelty without resentment of the agent being appropriate for the action. Now this is an argument with the conclusion that it is not appropriate to hold psychopaths accountable. So in that respect, Nelkin has some sympathy for it, because she doesn't think that it's appropriate to hold psychopaths accountable, but it contains a premise that she disagrees with it, that is specifically the idea that you can show cruelty and at the same time lack the... No, she actually agrees with that. Sorry. She agrees that an agent can act in a way that shows cruelty and at the same time lack the capacity. She just doesn't think that that's true of the psychopath. She does think that's true of the incorrigible racist. So she would agree that premise 5 is true is just true of the incorrigible racist, not the psychopath. Another argument, a related argument that again separates, she calls, her view is called the separable no blame, and she calls this the separable middle course view, because she says you can have one without the other, you can separate them. The unified blameworthy view says you can't separate them. If this is appropriate, then this is appropriate too. So a second argument that says you can separate these two is the argument from capacities to meet moral demands. And she seems to think this is more useful. Resentment of an agent for an action is appropriate only if the agent is accountable for that action. An agent is accountable for an action only if it is apt to make demands of that agent. It's starting the same way as the previous one. So resentment of an agent is appropriate only if it's apt to make demands of the agent. Again, we're spelling out accountability in terms of demands, and she likes that idea. It is apt to make demands of an agent only if the agent has the capacities needed to meet the demands. An agent can show cruelty without having the capacities needed to meet the demands. Again, she agrees with that. She thinks it's true of the incorrigible racist. She doesn't think that that's true of the psychopath because she doesn't think they're capable of cruelty. So an agent can show cruelty without resentment of that agent being appropriate. Now, what does the unified blameworthiness view say in response? Well, the unified blameworthiness view is defended in section 6, starting on page 378, by Angela Smith. And she says this: unlike mere appraisal of objects or people as good or bad, moral appraisal, which she says is what's going on in attributability. So when you appraise somebody, you're saying certain features are true of them. So for example, if I called you ugly, I wouldn't be such an asshole. But if I did, I would be appraising you on some measure. But I wouldn't be appraising you morally. Whereas if I call you cruel, I am appraising you. That is a moral appraisal, an example of a moral appraisal. Now, she says moral appraisal already brings with it a distinctive quality that, she says, undergirds our reactive attitudes. So if we're doing this, we're laying the groundwork that makes it appropriate to have reactive attitudes like resentment to you. So this is why it's the unified view. So here's what she says. Moral criticism, by its very nature, seems to address a demand to the target. Demands again. It calls upon the agent to explain or justify her rational activity in some area. If I'm called ugly, I may feel embarrassed, amused, or incredulous, but what I'm not likely to do is feel challenged. So she says, in giving you morally loaded appraisals, like calling you cruel, I am challenging you to justify yourself. The demand that I make of you, so there's already a demand here. What Nelkin has said is there's definitely a demand here. What Smith is saying, there's a demand here. If I am called selfish, by contrast, because that's a moral appraisal, I cannot regard that as merely an unwelcome description, like being called ugly. It is a direct challenge to me as a moral agent, and therefore implicitly calls for some kind of response on my part. I believe that it is this feature of moral criticism that it addresses a justificatory demand. It demands that you justify yourself. If you're called cruel, that is a challenge to you to explain and justify yourself, to get rid of that label. You have to do something. Whereas there's nothing that you can do to get rid of the label ugly, whereas there's something you can, well, plastic surgery aside, but there is something that you can do if you believe that you're not cruel, you can justify yourself. Okay, this is where I've called different kinds of demand. So Smith is saying, we've already seen these two arguments suggest that this involves a demand. Now, Smith, representing the unified blameworthiness account, is saying that this involves a kind of demand, a demand to justify. But what Nelkin is going to argue is that although this gives you a demand, it's not the same kind of demand that this gives you. The demand that this gives you is a demand to act differently. And you can be capable of justifying yourself without being capable. So, for example, the incorrigible racist, which is the person for whom, if you remember, Nelkin says it is appropriate to hold them, to blame them in this way, to say that they're cruel. They are capable of the demand to justify themselves, but they're not capable of acting differently. They're genuinely incorrigible, means that they cannot change their behavior. So the unified blameworthiness says these both involve a demand, so therefore this moves into this. And Nelkin is saying, well, all right, you can say that this involves a demand, but it's a demand to justify yourself, and that doesn't mean that you're automatically, it's appropriate to hold you accountable, because in order to be held accountable, you have to be capable of something more than justifying yourself. In order to be called cruel, you have to be capable of justifying yourself, and presumably she would say the psychopath is not even capable of that. But in order to be appropriately held accountable, you have to be capable of changing your behavior. Now, remember that I also said that she is making this kind of what may seem a strange claim, that the incorrigible racist shouldn't be held accountable. And shouldn't be resented. Talbot would challenge this. Talbot says that there is a sense in which an incorrigible racist can appropriately be resented by the slave that they have disrespected. And he argues that this is so because blaming them in the terms of resenting them can have a victim-centered purpose. So normally we say when we blame people in the sense of holding them accountable, the justification of the blame rests on the person being blamed. So in other words, it's appropriate to blame someone when they're capable of meeting the demands that the blame places on them. So again, it's not appropriate to blame a shark because they can't change their behavior. But if we think appropriate subjects of blame are people who are capable of changing their behavior. Now, if this incorrigible racist is genuinely defined as an incorrigible, cannot change their behavior. Again, she says, it may be the case that no actual slave owners are genuinely incorrigible, so it is appropriate to resent them. She says, I'm talking about a putative case of a person who genuinely can't change their behavior. Talbot argues it's still appropriate to hold them accountable, not because, and he justifies this not by looking at the person that is blaming, that is the subject of the blame, the racist, but the appropriateness of the blame derives from what it does from the person who's doing the blaming, say the slave that was owned. And they say, so for example, in blaming someone, you are making a protest, and that can be valuable in itself. It is so for example, he says, one point of blame is our own expression of protest and standing up against the judgments that have been expressed in the actions of those who have harmed us. So a slave saying, I blame you for owning me, is protesting and saying, my action of blaming you is my protest, is saying, I deserved better, and because I deserve better, it's appropriate for me to blame. Now, in response to this, Nelkin would say, it's appropriate to protest, yes, but that's not what blame is. So sure, yeah, by all means protest, do what works for you, but real blame has to be, whether or not it's appropriate, has to be judged by the subject being blamed, not the subject doing the blame. And she makes this clear by saying there can be all kinds of useful functions of blaming, but that doesn't make them appropriate. So she says, for example, your doing so impresses your boss and you get the job in the lab that allows you to find the cure for Alzheimer's disease. That would be a great result from blaming, but that doesn't make it appropriate. Okay, so at this point, it's worth summing up. Psychopaths are deemed to have certain incapacities. They're incapable of recognizing that other people present moral demands on them. They don't understand what a moral demand is. They don't see that, for example, your pain in itself presents a moral demand on them not to do it. So they lack respect, but they don't disrespect you. That's what Nelkin argues. So, here's the lay of the land. Gary Watson introduces this discussion of psychopaths, and part of the point of it was to draw a distinction between two kinds of blame. And it is generally accepted that you can distinguish these two. Now, the unified blameworthiness say that you can distinguish them conceptually, but you can't ever have one without the other. That it is what, everybody could agree, yes, we can talk about attributability distinct from the way that we talk about accountability. So in calling you cruel, I am doing attribution. In resenting you, I am holding you accountable. Everyone can agree. Okay, we agree on those labels. Where the separability views, the separable middle course view and the separable no blameworthiness view, Watson and Nelkin, where they go further is that they're not just conceptually distinct, they can differ in practice so that it can be appropriate to do one without the other. Where Watson and Nelkin differ is whom it is appropriate to do one without the other to. Watson said it's appropriate to attribute cruelty to the psychopath, but not appropriate to hold them accountable. Now, his argument for this is the argument from intelligibility. This is what his argument that it is inappropriate to hold them accountable is the argument from intelligibility. He doesn't really, I'm going to assume, defend calling them cruel. He says, he does talk about the Cyclops. So Nelkin uses discussion of the Cyclops as part of our argument that it is inappropriate to call psychopaths cruel. Because like the Cyclops, she says, they just don't have the requisite material to be cruel. They do find pleasure in causing other people pain, but that in itself is not enough for to be cruel. So even that much, which sounds like it's enough to be cruel, and her argument in support of that not being enough to count as cruelty is the symmetry argument, where she says, well, we wouldn't call somebody who finds pleasure in other people getting pleasure, we wouldn't call them kind necessarily. So by symmetry, if we can't call them kind, we can't call people who merely find pleasure in causing other people pain cruel unless they are capable of disrespect. and she stipulates that the psychopath is not capable of disrespect. So, of course, Watson came up with this example. He just didn't think that it applied to the psychopath. He says the psychopath is significantly more sophisticated than the Cyclops. So, yes, it's true that the Cyclops that they're not cruel, but he thought it was enough that the psychopath was sophisticated enough. Because psychopaths are sophisticated, which is why they go unrecognized, why they are able to manipulate people. I mean, if they had a big flashing light on their head, if they were incapable of disguising their psychopathy, they wouldn't be able to cause all the trouble that they cause. They wouldn't be able to manipulate people, but they're very good at disguising the fact that they are psychopaths. Up to a point. They do tend to get caught. Well, this is why the discussion of CEOs, because some people say CEOs are psychopaths who don't get caught. But they're still psychopaths, and look at what they do. That's a different debate. Okay, but so you see that the argument, Watson's argument that we shouldn't hold the psychopaths accountable is intelligibility. Nelkin prefers a different argument that says we shouldn't hold them accountable because they lack capacities. And there's a whole debate about this one requires violating ought implies can. You can get into that if you like. I don't want to go into it now. But she says that they lack relevant capacities, that is, of recognizing demands, of recognizing and being able to respond to demands to act differently. Now she says that's true of the genuinely incorrigible racists. Incorrigible means they can't change their ways, so they can't act differently, so therefore you can't hold them accountable. But they are capable of disrespect, the incorrigible racists, because they don't actually have brains that are different in the ways that psychopaths are, so they can be cruel. So the incorrigible racists can be cruel, but shouldn't be held accountable. Unified blameworthiness say, if you've got this, you've automatically got this. Yes, you can conceptually distinguish them, but you can never have them have this be appropriate without this being appropriate. They go together. Whenever it's appropriate to do this, it's appropriate to do this. Whenever it's not appropriate to do this, it's not appropriate to do this. And that's the argument from cruelty to accountability. Talbot argues in the other article that maybe there's sort of Talbot defends the unified blameworthiness account, and he says maybe there's kind of resentment light that is appropriate for, maybe we shouldn't call it resentment, but there's something close enough to resentment that is appropriate to psychopaths that it is appropriate. So Talbot, in responding to Nelkin, says, perhaps the thought involved in resentment is less complex than Nelkin is making it out to be. Perhaps it is simply the thought that another has intentionally and without justification treated me in a way that I did not deserve to be treated. This thought can reasonably be had of a psychopath, and it is a plausible specification of the representational content of resentment. Now, if you say, no, that's not resentment, he says, well, it's something, so let's call it resentment light, if you like, and that is appropriate to apply to a psychopath. So it is, you can hold them accountable, maybe not to the classic reactive attitudes, but I'm going to define these new reactive attitudes that are close enough, and it's appropriate, you can hold the psychopath accountable. I think if you meet a psychopath, you've been unlucky enough to encounter a psychopath, as, for example, David Shoemaker says he has, maybe it hits differently. Maybe the rubber hits the road then, and you really understand the appropriateness of resenting those people. Maybe that hasn't happened to Nelkin, I don't know. But it's an interesting debate. There you go.